Hello, everyone. To all those joining, thank you for signing on. We're going to be starting in just a couple minutes. We're also going to be live streaming this webinar on Facebook. I'll send you guys that link so that you can share it with families or friends that are interested. To all those joining, again, just repeating, we are going to be starting in just a few moments, waiting for a few more people to sign on, and we'll get started. Just so all of you know, we are going to be sharing the slides. So I'll send you guys that link afterward via email. I'm also going to send it on the via the chat box here on the Zoom page. So you will get the slides. This also is being recorded, but it's also being live streamed on Facebook. So if you go onto our Facebook page, Saving for College, I'll send that link as well. You'll be able to see that recording. And I think we're ready to get started. So just to introduce here our expert, Mark Hancheritz. He's the publisher and VP of research here at savingforcollege.com. My name's Julian. I work here with Mark, and Mark is the top expert when it comes to student loans. So a lot of you are probably first-time borrowers interested in learning about the student loan process. Maybe some of you already know the student loan process and are getting reacquainted with it. Mark is the guy to talk to when it comes to that. He's been quoted over 10,000 times when it comes to articles on Forbes, Wall Street Journal. Like, we're talking top press outlets. He's testified before Congress over the issue. So save your questions for the end. He is going to have a presentation that is very exhaustive. This is also a repeat webinar. So we've done this before. We know how it works. A lot of your questions are going to get answered by his presentation, but his Q&A is going to be a perfect opportunity for you guys to ask very specific questions and try to stump the expert. You're probably not going to be able to, but you can give it a try. So Mark, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Julian. So we decided to repeat this webinar, in fact, our entire series of Student Loans 101 webinars, because they were very popular, and we wanted to make sure that everybody who was interested in seeing these webinars had an opportunity to do so. So this is the first of 5 webinars. This one is about borrowing. The next one will be about repaying, then refinancing, then loan forgiveness, and then finally about choosing a loan. In addition, I will be writing 2 more Student Loan 101 talks, one about dealing with financial difficulty and one about how much is reasonable and affordable to borrow. We've also got a lot of content on our website about student loans. We've written over 500 student loan articles on savingforcollege.com. In a way, college savings is the antidote to student loan debt. So if you haven't saved enough, you're going to have to borrow. And so we wanted to make sure we covered that topic to help the people who use our website. So let's begin with, what is a student loan? A student loan is money that you borrow and you will have to repay, usually with interest. Repayment of student loans is deferred during the in-school period and for about typically 6 months after graduation or after the student drops below half-time enrollment. There are 2 types of student loans. There are federal student loans and there are private student loans. The federal ones are funded by the federal government, whereas private lenders fund the others, and that can be a bank, a credit union, a non-bank financial institution, state loan agencies, and other organizations that want to make it possible for people to pay for college. In addition, we use the term student loan generically to refer to all education financing. The term includes parent loans, which are borrowed by parents to help their child pay for college. Now, private student loans tend to require a credit-worthy cosigner more than 90% of private student loans to undergraduate students require a credit-worthy cosigner, about 2/3 of private student loans to graduate students. So in a way, with a private student loan, the parent is usually still going to be obligated to repay the loan as an alternative to parent loans, and the parent's still on the hook. The main difference being whether the student's also obligated to repay the debt. Now, student loans have limits, how much you can borrow in any given year, as well as how much you can borrow overall. Now, both federal and private student loans do not have prepayment penalties, which means you can make extra payments at any time. You can pay off the remaining loan balance at any time, or you can just make an extra payment every month or once a year, whenever you feel like doing so, to accelerate repayment of your student loans and therefore save money on interest over the life of the loan. So let's talk a little bit about interest. Interest is a fee that's expressed as a percentage that is charged for the use of money. So on the first year of a $10,000 loan with a 10% interest rate, you would pay 10% of $10,000 or $1,000 for the use of that money. Plus, you would also have to make a payment of the principal balance of the loan. Now, there's two types of interest. There's simple interest and compound interest. Simple interest is charged based just on the principal balance of the loan, whereas compound interest is charged not only on the principal, but also on the interest balance of the loan, or the total loan balance. And while student loans charge simple interest, they can end up charging compound interest if that interest is added to the loan balance during, say, an in-school or grace period, or any other period of non-payment or deferment or forbearance. And then when that interest is capitalized, added to the loan balance, you then start charging interest on that interest, which increases the cost of that loan. Now, people sometimes assume that, oh, interest is only charged when a loan is in an active repayment status. The reality is that as soon as that loan is dispersed, interest is going to be charged, it's going to accrue during any period, regardless of whether it's a period of payment or a period of non-payment. So during deferment and forbearance periods, interest is charged. The difference between a deferment and forbearance is that on certain loans, the subsidized loans, the federal government pays the interest as it accrues, but not on the unsubsidized loans. And if you happen to be in default on your loan or delinquent on your loan, interest is still going to accrue on that loan. So let's talk a little bit more on capitalization of interest. Okay. So during a period of deferment or forbearance, or even when you're not paying your loan, maybe you're delinquent or in default on the loan, interest would normally still accrue and will get added to the loan balance through a process called capitalization. And that increases the amount of debt. Now, there's differences in capitalization frequency. With federal loans in the direct loan program, the accrued but unpaid interest is capitalized once when the loan enters repayment or at the end of that deferment or forbearance period. On a private student loan, it may be capitalized more frequently as monthly. And the problem with interest capitalization is not only is your loan getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but you start having interest being charged on interest, that compound interest that we just discussed. And that when the loan enters repayment, that status changes in the loan is when interest gets capitalized. And I give on the slide a formula for the impact of capitalized interest on the loan balance, where if B is the loan balance, B0 being the initial loan balance, then you take the number of months of interest times the interest rate, and the monthly interest rate and multiply that by the loan balance. That's the interest that accrued. And then you add it to the original loan balance, yielding the new loan balance. Now, here we have the two interest formulas, getting a little bit technical here. Simple interest is simply the loan balance times the annualized interest rate divided by the number of days in the year, usually 365, but in a leap year it could be 366. And you multiply this by the number of days in the actual accrual period, which might be 30 days, 29 or 28 in February, 31 certain months. And that's the simple interest that accrued during that time period. With compound interest, it gets exponential. So you multiply the loan balance instead of by the proportional number of days times the interest rate, it is the interest rate divided by the number of days in the year plus 1, and then that gets exponentiated by the number of days in the accrual period. And you can see where the difference here is between multiplication and exponentiation. You end up with a much faster growth rate. Now let's talk a little bit about the interest rates on federal and private student loans. Now, July 1st, these interest rates changed, and I have not updated this slide. So I'll tell you what the current new rates are as of July 1st on the federal loans. On the federal Stafford loan for undergraduate students, it is 2.75% fixed. On the for graduate students, it's 4.3%, and for plus loans, it's 5.3%. So you can see they went down by a little bit more than 1 3/4 percentage points. These loan fees are still in effect, but they're going to go down slightly this October. And that 2.75% interest rate on the federal Stafford loan for undergraduate students is the historically lowest interest rate ever charged. The previous record was in 2004-05 when it was 2.875%. The interest rates for graduate students and the plus loan, the parent plus loan and grad plus loan, those are the lowest since 2004-05, but the year before that, they were at a little bit lower interest rate because the formulas have changed. Now, the interest rates on these federal loans are fixed rates. They do not change for the life of the loan. But each year, and which runs from July 1st through June 30th, there is a new fixed rate. And these interest rates are set by a formula that is set by law. And the 2.75% interest rate is for the 2020-21 academic year. Now, these private student loan interest rates, they've gone down a little bit since I created this slide, which was just about a month ago. But they also have gone down because of the cuts in the Federal Reserve Board in the prevailing interest rates. And these were effective as of May 1st of 2020. So just 2 months ago, actually. But you can see that private loans offer both fixed and variable rates. Most of them offer both. And that the variable rates are a little bit lower than the fixed rates. But a variable rate can go up, it can go down, depending on changes in prevailing interest rates. Since we're at or near historic lows, they pretty much have nowhere to go but up. So if you're choosing between a variable and a fixed rate loan, if you expect that you're going to be repaying that loan for the full repayment term on that private loan, you should probably go with the fixed rate so that you have a predictable monthly loan payment. Whereas if you expect that you're going to be able to pay off that loan within just a few years, and you're planning to do so and you're capable of doing so, then a variable rate might be a better choice because you can pay off that debt before the interest rates rise too much and save some money on the interest. And you can see also that the interest rates are pretty similar among the lenders. They are like Sallie Mae is 4.74%, Discover is 4.74% as their lowest advertised rate for fixed rate loans. But it's worthwhile to shop around because these interest rates that they advertise aren't necessarily the interest rates that you're going to get. It's a range. And unfortunately, most students end up getting the high end of the range instead of the low end of the range. To get that low end of the range, you have to have a really good credit score or have a credit-worthy cosigner who has an excellent credit. Now, we mentioned interest rates. Now let's turn to loan fees. Loan fees, in a way, are upfront interest, kind of like points on a mortgage that you're paying upfront to cover the origination of the loan or as an insurance fee against default of the loan. And they're usually deducted from the disbursement check. So you don't actually pay these yourself, rather the loan balance, the disbursement that you receive from the lender is lower even though you borrowed more. Borrowers can also, they want to have a certain dollar amount net, they can ask the lender to add the fees to the loan balance so that they net out the same amount. The private student loans, generally speaking, have a 0% loan fee. There's just one or two that have non-zero loan fees. And what they've done is roll the loan fees into the interest rate. So that you're paying a little bit higher of an interest rate in exchange for having no fees on the loan. And every 1% in fees is about the equivalent of 1/4% higher interest rate if you assume a 10-year repayment term. If you have a different repayment term, the relationship is a little bit different. Now, I'm talking here about the origination fees and guarantee fees that are charged up front. There are also other types of loan fees that are charged at the point in which they're incurred, such as if you're late with a payment, there will be a fee depending on the lender. It could be as much as 6% of the late payment amount. And if you default on the loan, there might be collection charges that, for federal loans, can be as much as 1/5 of the loan payment, or if it's added to the loan balance, as much as a 25% increase in the loan balance. Mentioned before that loans have limits on the amount you can borrow per year and overall. So let's talk about the loan limits on federal loans. So the loan limits, the annual loan limits depend on the year in school, lower loan limits for freshmen than for seniors, whether you're a dependent student or an independent student, and your grade level. Are you undergraduate, graduate, what degree you're pursuing? So with the federal loans for dependent students, you can borrow up to $5,500 as a freshman from the Federal Direct Stafford loan if you're a dependent student. If you're an independent student, the limit is $4,000 higher, $9,500. As a senior, you can borrow up to $7,500 as a dependent undergraduate student, or additional $5,000 as an independent student. Now, there are an additional type of loan called a subsidized loan, which is a subset of this borrowing. It has a lower limit for the subsidized Federal Direct Stafford loans, $3,500 as a sophomore, up to $5,500 as a senior, and it's the same for dependent and independent students. Now, the aggregate limit on these undergraduate loans is $31,000 for a dependent student and $57,500 for an independent student. But if you were to sum those four annual limits, you would get to a total of $27,000, which is less. So to reach that $31,000, you have to borrow for 5 years, not 4. And similarly for the independent students. Now for graduate students, they have higher Stafford loan limits, $20,500 a year. If they're going to medical school and if they have an additional $20,000 they can borrow. And there's also the Grad Plus and Parent Plus loans, which don't have an annual limit other than the college's cost of attendance minus other aid that you've received. So now let's talk about, given that you have pretty generous loan limits, it's certainly at the aggregate level, especially for graduate school, let's talk a little bit about what is reasonable and affordable amount that you can or should borrow. So reasonable and affordable is, I define it in terms of the repayment term. How much time is a reasonable time to repay your loans? I figure 10 years is reasonable. If it's longer than 10 years, you're going to start having an impact on the next generation. And a 20 or 25 or 30-year repayment term means that when your children go to college, you're still going to be repaying your own student loans. So you'll be less willing to borrow and less willing to have saved for their college education. So you need to keep the repayment term relatively short, 10 years or less. And given that that's a reasonable repayment term, well, the student loan debt is reasonable and affordable if you can repay it in a reasonable amount of time. So based on this, we can do an analysis that works out for the range of interest rates available on student loans that roughly your total student loan debt at graduation should be less than your annual starting salary, and ideally a lot less. So now let's figure out, what's your total student loan debt at graduation? Well, you take your first year borrowing, multiply it by the length of your educational program, and that should be within about 15% of the actual total student loan debt at graduation, because you borrow a little bit more each year because the loan limits are higher. And to compare it with your salary, well, it's hard to predict what salaries are going to be in 4 years, but you could use the current salary. And you can find salary data on a variety of websites like payscale.com, salary.com, NACE, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov. Now, just because we say that total debt is less than annual income doesn't mean you should borrow to the limit, or worse, borrow more up to the annual and aggregate limits, because every dollar you borrow is going to have to be repaid with interest. So don't treat those loan limits as target and borrow less than your expected annual starting salary, not up to that amount. If you borrow what you need, not what you can. And if your total student loan debt is more than your annual income, I consider that to be excessive debt, and you're going to struggle to make loan payments on a 10-year repayment term at that amount. It's going to exceed 15% typically of your gross monthly income. And about 1 in 6 students graduate with excessive debt, which is about a quarter of those who graduate with student loan debt. And if you graduate with too much debt, it's going to affect your lifestyle. Right? You're going to delay major life cycle events like buying a car, getting married, buying a house, having children, saving for your children's college educations, and saving for your own retirement. Of students who borrow excessive debt, half report that they delayed buying a home, a third delayed having children, and a quarter delayed getting married. And you'll be less likely to pursue additional education. Students who graduate with no debt are twice as likely to go on to graduate school as students compared with students who graduate with some debt. And you'll also be less willing you'll have to take a job in your whatever job's available as opposed to a job in your desired career path, because you'll have to pick the job that pays the best as opposed to the job that meets your other goals. And you may also have to take on a second job in the evening and weekends to help repay your student loans, and you'll end up working more than you really like. And if you find that you need to borrow private loans or parent loans, that may be a sign that you're borrowing too much money, and maybe you should go to a less expensive college. So what you want to do is keep your total student loan debt at graduation in sync with your income. If you are pursuing a career that pays better, then maybe you can borrow more. But if you're pursuing a career that doesn't pay very well, maybe you should borrow less. So I said that in college, maybe go to a cheaper college. And that's because the amount of debt at graduation correlates very strongly with the cost of the college's cost of attendance. Students are both more likely to borrow at a more expensive college, and they graduate with more debt at a more expensive college. And here we're showing that as we increase the amount of the cost of attendance, a higher cost of attendance includes a higher average private student loan amount at graduation. And it's almost a linear growth. I mean, now if we look at the average debt at graduation, looking at this data a different way, the net price of the college is a strong predictor. The net price is the difference between the college's cost of attendance and the gift aid, the grants and scholarships and other money that you don't have to repay. It's the amount that you're going to have to pay from savings, current income, and loans. And if you have no savings and your current income is limited, then it's mostly going to be loans. So the net price does have a very strong correlation at colleges that have a higher net price. And that can be because they charge more or because they give less generous financial aid. Now, private student loans tend to be secondary financing. First, you borrow federal loans because they're cheaper, they are more available, and they have better repayment terms. But once you reach those loan limits, and more students are in bachelor degree programs are reaching those loan limits, you end up having to borrow private and parent loans. So this chart shows the percentage of the overall loan volume that comes from private student loans. I mean, back in around 2008, it was as much as a quarter of all loan volume came from private student loans. But then in 2008, the federal government, Congress, changed the loan limits, increasing them. And also in 2006, the Grad Plus loan became available. And those two combined to cause a big decline in the percentage of all borrowing that was from federal versus private. Private loans ended up in 2011 being only 7% of the overall total loan volume. But it's grown since then because the federal loan limits haven't changed since 2008. And more students are borrowing to that limit. We are overdue for an increase in the federal undergraduate student loan limits. And it's been 11 years since Congress last reauthorized the Higher Education Act. So now let's look at the types of federal student loans. I mentioned subsidized and unsubsidized loans, whether the government pays the interest during that in-school and grace period. If it's a subsidized loan, eligibility depends on financial need, whereas if it's a unsubsidized loan, it doesn't depend on financial need. You can be extremely wealthy and still get these loans, which are relatively lower in cost than private student loans. So we're showing here the 5 main types of federal education loans: the subsidized Stafford loans, the unsubsidized Stafford loans, Grad Plus loans, Parent Plus loans, and consolidation loans. These loans differ as to who is the borrower. For example, subsidized Stafford loans are borrowed by the student, not the parent, and they're only available to undergraduate students. In 2012, Congress got rid of them for graduate students. And there have been proposals to get rid of them for undergraduate students as well, to make all federal loans unsubsidized. There's the other major difference is whether you need to have financial need to receive the loan, and who pays the interest during an in-school and grace period. If it's subsidized, it's the government. If it's unsubsidized, you're responsible for that interest. And if you don't pay it as it accrues, it gets capitalized. Now, I mentioned the federal direct consolidation loan. That's a way of taking the loans that you accumulate during your college career, which can be 8 loans, maybe more, and combine them into a single loan with a single interest rate. And that interest rate is fixed, just like the original loans, but it's based on the interest rates of the loans that are included in that consolidation loan through a weighted average. So it doesn't really change the cost of the loan, it's simply streamlining the repayment process. Some cases you may want to keep the loans separate so that you can target the loan that has the highest interest rate for quicker repayment. So now let's talk about which loans are better and which loans are not. If we're comparing federal loans with private loans, there are some key differences, but generally speaking, federal loans are better than private student loans. The interest rates on federal loans are fixed, whereas private loans give you a choice of fixed or variable. But the interest rates on the federal loans, if you're comparing a fixed rate loan to a fixed rate loan, are generally lower than on private student loans. The main exception is when you're comparing the federal Parent Plus loan or Grad Plus loan, which has the highest interest rate among the federal loans, with private student loans where the borrower has excellent credit. You may be able to get a private student loan that is competitive on the interest rate with the federal loans, especially when you consider the impact of the loan fees. But private student loans don't have the same benefits that federal loans have, like longer deferments and forbearances, income-driven repayment plans, the current payment pause and interest waiver, loan forgiveness options. There are a lot of things that the federal loans offer that private loans do not. Also, death and disability discharges, and only about half of private student loans offer these. So you're getting more with the federal loans, and it's still costing you less in most cases. Federal loans are not credit underwritten, whereas private loans are. Federal loans require the FAFSA, whereas private student loans do not. You have to be enrolled at least half time to receive a federal loan. Private student loans do not necessarily have the same requirement, though they do require you to have a very good credit score, at least typically a 640 or 650 FICO score. But the higher your credit score, the more likely you are to get the loan. And your interest rate will be lower if you have a higher credit score. The private loans do offer more options for making payments during that in-school period, but nothing stops you from making in-school payments on the federal loans. There are no prepayment penalties, so there's no reason why you can't if you want to do that. There are more available repayment terms on federal loans, whereas private student loans, especially the fixed rate loans, tend to keep the repayment terms short. If you go with a shorter repayment term, as little as 5 years, you're going to get a lower interest rate on those private student loans. Income-driven repayment is only available on federal loans. There's one loan in Rhode Island, a private student loan, that offers income-based repayment. But aside from that, and that's the exception to the rule, private student loans don't offer income-driven repayment plans. And you can get teacher loan forgiveness, public service loan forgiveness, and other loan forgiveness options on federal loans, not on private student loans. So if we look at which loans are more or less expensive, the Stafford loan, especially the subsidized Stafford loan, is the least expensive of the loans. That's followed by the PLUS loan. It's got a higher interest rate and is more expensive. Then there's home equity loans, which are not education loans, but you can borrow money through a home equity loan or line of credit or cash out refinance and use that money to pay for college, but it's secured by the home. So if you default on a home equity loan, you're going to lose the home. Whereas if you default on a federal student loan or a private student loan, the lender can't repossess your education. Then there's private education loans, and most expensive are credit cards, assuming that you aren't playing this game of constantly switching to a new credit card and getting a 0% interest rate for a few months. At some point, you run out of that option. So let's talk about how you apply for federal loans and private student loans. So first thing that you need to do is file the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Congress decided to require this to make sure that you got all the gift aid, the grants and other money that doesn't need to be repaid, like the Pell Grant, before you borrow. Next, the college is going to determine your eligibility for these loans. They're going to look at what the total cost of attendance is, what the other aid you're receiving, and then that difference is the amount that you can borrow. And they will also determine whether you have financial need and therefore can qualify for a subsidized loan as opposed to just the unsubsidized loans. The college will then send out a financial aid award letter or notification that tells you about your loan eligibility. Now, in some of these letters, they're not going to tell you the maximum you can borrow. They're going to tell you an average number. And you need, or they'll tell you the maximum number, but you don't have to borrow that amount. You can borrow less. They will have you go through loan counseling. It's called entrance counseling, which tells you about the terms and conditions of your loans. Some colleges will even put in some personal finance, financial literacy training as part of that, but that's not required. And then they will have you sign what's called a master promissory note. A master promissory note is good for up to 10 years at a single institution. If you transfer to another college, you'll have to sign a new master promissory note. If you take more than 10 years to graduate, well, you'll have to sign a new master promissory note. But the idea is that you only have to sign this document once for a typical college career. Now, if you are a first-year student who has never borrowed before, depending on the college, there may be a delay before you can get the loan money. There's a 30-day delay at colleges that have more than a minimal cohort default rate. So if enough students at that college default on their loans, they're going to be required to delay that first disbursement by 30 days. And that only applies to first-year, first-time undergraduate borrowers. There may also be a requirement that they split it into 2 or more disbursements, whereas colleges with very low default rates, they can do it in a single disbursement. Now, when you get a loan disbursement, the college first applies it to their charges for tuition and fees, and if you're living in college-controlled or operated housing, also room and board. Any remaining credit balance will be refunded to you within 14 days. And that's the money that you can use to buy your textbooks or pay your rent if you're living off campus in an apartment, or for other educational expenses. Now, private student loans, you apply directly on the lender's website usually. You don't have to fill out the FAFSA, but they will do a credit check. They are able to do these credit checks in real time. Usually they will give you an answer within a few minutes, but there may be a secondary review, especially if there's something unusual about your credit history, where they will have someone look over your credit history to make sure that there isn't anything that they need to be worried about. I often joke that they will give you your denial within seconds, but your approval may take a few days. But you still get a pretty rapid turnaround. It used to take a lot longer. And it's going to, whether you get the loan is going to depend on your credit score. And if you have a cosigner, on your cosigner's credit score. They take the higher of the 2 credit scores and use that to determine eligibility and the interest rates that you're going to pay. In addition, the lender will contact your college and have the loan school certified. What that means is the college is going to confirm that you are a student at the college, that you're eligible for the loans, and what the amount of the loan is. Most private student loans cap the amount that they will lend at the cost of attendance minus other aid received. So they need to certify the loan with the college to make sure that you're not borrowing more than you're eligible for. Now, there used to be this loan type of loan called a direct-to-consumer loan that didn't contact the college, but it was prone to fraud, and that's why most lenders stopped doing it. School certified loans are eligible for the federal student loan interest deduction on your federal income taxes. Direct-to-consumer loans may not be eligible for that. Now, what should you do before you apply for a private student loan? First thing I say, you should shop around to find the loan with the lowest interest rate. But even before that, you need to check your credit score, or your credit history, because there can be errors in your credit history that affect your credit score. And that can in turn affect interest rates on your loans as well as your eligibility. Each of the three major credit reporting agencies, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, participate in this website created by the Federal Trade Commission called annualcreditreport.com, where you can get a free copy of your credit report from each of them through that website. If you go directly to them, they'll charge you, but if you go through that website, it's free. Now, annual credit report, normally you're limited to one free credit report per 12-month period. But during the pandemic, through April 30th of 2021, you can get it once a week. So if you need to, you can get it. Now, if there are any errors, you can correct them by disputing them. The creditor then has to confirm the accuracy of that report. And if they find that it is not correct, or they can't confirm it within 30 days, they have to remove the negative information from your credit report. And it's worthwhile to do this so that when the lender looks at your credit score and pulls your credit report, they're not going to see inaccurate information. So you should do this at least 30 days before you plan on applying for a private student loan. And you should also consider doing things and starting as soon as possible to improve your credit score, because it has such an impact on whether you get the loan and how much it's going to cost you. And that can include making payments on all your debts, not just your student loans, on time by the due date. Never be late with a payment, because that can hurt your credit scores by 50 to 100 points. And if you've got, if you're carrying a balance on your credit cards, which try to discourage people from doing, pay it down. The lower percentage utilization of your credit, the higher your credit score. Then now let's talk about how to cut the cost of borrowing student loans. Right. So first of all, focus on free money first, because grants and scholarships don't have to be repaid. Part-time student employment can also help by reducing your need for debt. But most students use their work-study money as walking around money to pay for eating out, entertainment, and other miscellaneous expenses, as opposed to paying tuition. But you can earn up to a little bit more, and somewhere between $6,000 and $7,000 a year before it affects your eligibility for financial aid. But I would discourage you from pursuing a full-time job while you're going to school, because it'll take away too much time from your academics. I mean, students who work more in a full-time job are half as likely to graduate within 6 years as compared with students who work 12 hours or less a week. Tuition installment plans are offered by many colleges, and they're good alternative to long-term debt. With a tuition installment plan, you make your college bill, the amount that you have to pay to the college, is split into equal monthly installments, usually over the course of a term, maybe over a course of 12 months, but there's no interest being charged. Instead, you're being charged a one-time upfront fee that's usually less than $100 in exchange for this. And so if you can afford to pay the college bills, just not all at once in one big lump sum, this can be a reasonable alternative as opposed to a long-term 10-year or longer student loan, which will increase your cost because you'll be paying lots and lots of interest. And in general, what you want to do is borrow only what you need, not what you can. you should live like a student while you're in school so you don't have to live like a student after you graduate. Let's consider a typical expense. Like you don't like the cafeteria food, so you eat out once a week. You buy pizza every week. Well, that's $2,000 over a 4-year college career if you do that every week. And every dollar you borrow is going to cost $2 by the time you repay the debt on average. So $2,000 becomes $4,000 by the time you repay the debt. That's an awful lot of pizza. And it may not be pizza. It could be beverages and candy from a vending machine, or specialty drinks from a coffee house, cafe, or a juice shop. And those can all add up to thousands of additional dollars that you're going to have to repay. And so what you should do before you buy something with student loan money is ask yourself if you should still buy it at twice the price, because that's realistically what you're going to pay for it. And so maybe that'll make you hesitate before you spend a little bit too much money. Federal loans are cheaper. You focus on the interest rates and fees on these loans to identify which loans are going to be less expensive for you. That can save you money. And if you're going to borrow private student loans, borrow with a creditworthy cosigner, because they can help you not only qualify for the loans, but get a lower interest rate. Now, savingforcollege.com is about college savings plans, 529 plans, and we like to remind people that it is cheaper to save than to borrow. Every dollar you save is a dollar less you're going to have to borrow. Every dollar you win in scholarships is a dollar less you're going to have to borrow. So, and college savings is the antidote to student loan debt. And here's an example. If you save $200 a month before college for 10 years, and I picked 6.8% kind of arbitrarily. It used to be the typical student loan interest rate, but now these days interest rates are a little bit lower. But if you save $200 a month for 10 years, you're going to accumulate $34,000 and change. If you borrow that money, instead of saving it, you're going to pay over that 10-year period $396 a month instead of $200 a month. The difference is when you save, you earn the interest. When you borrow, you pay the interest. Now, other examples won't exactly be a factor 2 difference, but it is always cheaper to save than to borrow, assuming that the interest rates on debt are higher than the interest rates on savings. Now, student loans are complicated financial instruments. And you might think, oh, it's simply just charging interest, but there's a lot of complexity inherent in them. And a lot of students find it difficult, even some parents, to understand the relationship between the interest rates and the payments and the fees. So, and here I'm giving an example. You have a loan with a 4% fee and a 9% interest rate, and a loan with a 5% fee and an 8% interest rate. Which of them is the better deal? Well, the loan with the 8% interest rate is the better deal because an extra 1% in interest is about equivalent to 4% in fees, assuming a 10-year repayment term. Now, they have this concept called APR, annualized percentage rate, that they often display with loans, but you have to look at what the repayment term is on the loans. If it's a 10-year loan both ways, then that's an okay comparison. But if it's one loan has a 10-year term, the other has a 20-year term, or 5 years and 10 years, APR is misleading because the longer repayment term, all else being equal, is going to have a lower APR. Doesn't really make all that much sense, but because you're paying more interest over that longer term, but because you're spreading out the cost of the fees over that longer term, it affects the APR. So what I recommend that you do instead is look at what the monthly payments are on the loan and what the total payments are on the loan. You can use student loan calculators. We have them on our website to do that. And what you're going to find is that the lower the monthly loan payment, the higher the total interest over the life of the loan, or the higher the monthly loan payment, the lower total interest you're going to pay over the life of the loan. So here's a screen snapshot of our student loan calculator. It lets you put in some figures. Here we have $30,000 in debt, a 5% interest rate, and a 10-year repayment term. And it shows you what your monthly loan payment will be, as well as your total payments and total interest. And you can play what if games. What if I did a 5-year repayment term? How does that affect the total payments and total interest and the monthly payment? And we also have loan comparison calculators that can do that for you. So let's give you some advice. And some of this is a repeat of what I've said earlier. You want to try to avoid interest capitalization as much as possible. So avoid leaves of absence or other time periods when you are, and your interest is going to continue to accrue. And also, if your leave of absence is long enough, you lose your grace period for when you ultimately graduate. You should borrow no more than your expected annual starting salary in your desired occupation. Don't borrow to the loan limits. Borrow as little as you can, as little as you need, not as much as you can. You should open and read every mail that you get from the college about money or the lender, because all too often it's going to be something important, like maybe the lender doesn't know that you're still in school, and so it thinks that your loan went into repayment. Try to get organized. Have a little chart where you record all your loans, who the lender is, when repayment starts, what the interest rate is, how much you borrowed, and keep all the documents relating to your loans in file folders, and make a good note of any deadlines. Maybe add a reminder to the to your calendar if you have a smartphone or a paper calendar, 2 weeks before you expect the loan to enter repayment, so that if you haven't received a coupon or a statement for that loan, you can call the lender to find out what you need to do and how much you need to pay and where to send that payment. The entrance and exit interviews, they can be a little bit boring, but they're important, especially the exit interviews. They tell you about all your payment options so that you know that you have income-driven repayment on the federal loans, or what happens if you encounter financial difficulty? What are your options for dealing with that financial difficulty? And finally, budget before you borrow. And you should know not just what you're going to be using that student loan money for, but how you're going to be able to repay that student loans after you graduate. Increasing your awareness of the debt helps you exercise restraint in borrowing. So now we'll open it up for the questions.
Awesome, thanks a lot, Mark. And we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start with the first one we got. What are your thoughts on colleges taking a percentage of future salary to pay for tuition versus taking out a student loan? What factors should a student consider when selecting between these options?
Okay, so these are called income share agreements, where you agree to pay a percentage of your income after graduation for a period of time. They're often promoted as being the solution to the student loan problem. They're just another form of debt. Instead of a fixed monthly payment for a number of years, it is a fixed percentage of income for a number of years. And the income share agreements that I've seen so far are actually charging a little bit more than the equivalent private student loan. So I would suggest that you exercise caution with them. Look at what the percentage of income will be required, and calculate what your total payments will be over the life of this loan. There are some attractive aspects of them. I mean, low-income students don't fear them the same way they fear debt, because they perceive them as shifting the risk of failure from the borrower to the lender. But they're still, they're relatively new, and they're trying to get themselves exempted from usury laws and other consumer protections, which makes me very nervous about them.
Got it. We have another question here. Common advice is to always take the Stafford loan first before any other loans. Is there any fact pattern where a private loan would be the better choice? No origination fees and lower interest rates. If co-signed by a qualified buyer, assuming you take the variable rate, when would the private loan make sense to go first?
Well, the reason why the Stafford loan is usually your default option, why you should borrow federal first, is because it's the least expensive option, where that interest rate, fixed interest rate, is lower than the fixed interest rates offered by private student loans. The Parent Plus loan is a higher interest rate, and so there is the private student loans can be more competitive there. But with the federal student loans for undergraduate students, the private lenders can't beat that rate. Plus, I mean, that rate is available to every borrower regardless of their credit history, whereas on the private student loans, I mean, low rates are only available to people who have excellent credit. And we're talking people who have FICO scores in the 800s. Whereas with the plus loans, there may be a little bit more play in the joints where you might be able to get a better deal from a private loan if you have excellent credit. Also, the federal loans have more consumer protections. They have death and disability discharges, closed school discharges, identity theft discharges, a whole host of ways of getting rid of these loans if you are able to repudiate the loan or unable to afford to repay the loan. Whereas the options with private student loans are much more limited in general.
Gotcha. Another question here. When you get a loan to pay the bill for a semester, when the next semester comes along, do you get a different loan or can you borrow more from the existing lender?
Okay, so typically you're going to get one loan per year, but it's going to be split into multiple installments. Usually at the beginning of each term, you'll get a disbursement from that loan. So you won't need to reapply until the next year. But with private student loans, you'll have to apply each year. And with federal loans, you have to file the FAFSA each year before you can get the student loans.
Okay, another one here. With my 529 accounts down approximately 30% year over year due to the COVID economy, do you recommend taking out a loan for the 2020-2021 year in the hopes that the 529s improve to original value or more in the next 12 months?
Right. So the 529 plans did drop, and the S&P 500 dropped as much as a third at its low point, but it's recovered a lot since then. So I would encourage you to see if you can't delay taking that distribution from the 529 plan. And you may just need to wait a month or two for your plan to have recovered enough. You can take student loans and then use the money from the 529 plan to repay the student loans. The Secure Act last year added a benefit where you can take a qualified distribution from a 529 plan to repay up to $10,000 of federal and private student loans. That's a lifetime limit per borrower. So even if you have multiple 529 plans, you can do only up to $10,000 per borrower. But it does give you some flexibility if you think that it's better to wait for the 529 plan to fully recover. But in many cases, the 529 plans should have recovered by now.
Right. Another one here. Do you know how being in the military after graduation will affect costs you have to pay for your loans? Do they offer any loan forgiveness or help pay for loans?
Right. So there are a couple of benefits for members of the U.S. Armed Forces who are on active duty. First of all, the interest rates on the federal loans will be capped at 6%. Now, with current interest rates lower than that, that doesn't yield much of a benefit. But older loans were at higher rates, so that cap is beneficial. There's also a military service deferment that suspends the obligation to repay your loans while you're on active duty and for up to half a year after you come back from active duty. And there are a variety of other benefits available. There are also some private programs that will help you repay your student loans while you're on active duty service. Uh, there are also military student loan repayment programs, which you can get when you enlist. Um, a lot depends. I mean, you have a trade-off between the GI Bill and the student loan repayment assistance, which can repay, depending on the service, as much as $65,000 with a certain annual limit per year of your federal loans. Generally, private student loans don't get this benefit.
Got it. Another one here. With the advancement of COVID-19, many colleges are going to online instruction, limiting on-campus classes. Thus, many students may be staying at home. Will this necessarily cause a lower amount of students needing student loans moving forward, thus decreasing total student loan debt overall?
I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on borrowing. When a student stays at home, their cost of attendance figure changes. Instead of having room and board be based on the cost of the dormitory or the independent living groups, the fraternities and sororities, the college has a different allowance for the cost of room and board when you're living at home. I mean, some of them will even zero it out, saying, well, you don't have to pay anything, because when you live at home with mom and dad, it's free. I don't agree with that, and you do have some real costs. Those are lower, which may mean that you'll have less need for student loans. Though a lot depends on each college's financial aid packaging philosophy. I mean, some colleges won't give you grants until you borrowed a certain amount of money. And so when the costs go down, your grants go down, but your loans stay the same.
Gotcha. And we're right at time, but we'll leave time for one more question I have here. It is, I just had it. Here it is. I recall you said that interest rates may drop in October. Should I wait until October to take out the loan to take advantage of the lower interest rates?
Okay, so what I was referring to is the loan fees. The loan fees are going to drop from, let me see, 1.056% 1.06% to 1.057%. It's not a much. It's like a tiny fraction. So I wouldn't wait until then to borrow. The interest rates on student loans and the new federal loans just went into effect on July 1st. And I would expect the interest rates on private student loans to hit bottom sometime this month, and maybe within the next week or two. So you don't need to borrow to wait to borrow to get a lower interest rate. But I don't think there's any real rush in terms of needing to lock in a low rate, because the financial environment, the interest rate environment, is going to remain pretty much the same through the end of the year. And until we have a vaccine and effective antiviral drugs, I don't see the economy heading anywhere different than it already is. And so I don't expect that to have an impact. The payment pause and interest waiver ends on September 30th. So if you were thinking about refinancing federal loans into a private loan, you might want to wait until then. I tend to discourage refinancing federal loans into private loans anyway, because the federal loans have so much better benefits. But sometimes people have older federal loans that have much higher interest rates, or they want to change their loan servicer as a motivation for refinancing, in which case I just wait until the payment pause and interest waiver is over. And there's a possibility that that may get extended by a year. The HEROES Act, which passed the House but is stalled in the Senate, proposed extending it not just to by an additional year, but to all federal loan borrowers and even private student loan borrowers. So wait until September before the end of October 1st before considering whether to refinance if you're refinancing federal loans into a private student loan. Also, we will go over all the questions that have been submitted, and we will, if they aren't already answered in articles on our website, we'll write new articles to answer them. We did that the first time we did this webinar. We'll do it again this time.
Yep. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. I just launched a poll. Before you log off, if you could just fill out those 3 questions real quick, helps us make these webinars even better for all of you. So thanks a lot, Mark, for your time. Thank you everybody who participated, and for those who got their questions answered. We're here to help, and we're gonna have another webinar next week. I'm blanking right now on the exact day and time, but we're gonna be sending that via email on a follow-up to this webinar.